Greetings one and all, Chris Courtney here for New Pragmatic. I'm so glad to have you along for this video on typography. In this particular session on typography, we're going to be focusing on type anatomy and terminology. It is so important that as a designer, you develop an ability to talk about typography in a way that is translatable with other designers and other people on the teams that you work on. Specifically, the ability to develop a vocabulary around typography is going to increase your understanding of instructions coming from other people. It's also going to increase your understanding of typography itself. And once you become more acquainted with the proper terminology around typography, you become more confident in the work that you're going to be doing with typography. Let's take this phrase as a starting point. At smaller sizes, most effective type selections will have a larger X height, open counters, and medium stroke contrast. If you know what all that means, fantastic. You can move on to the next chapter. Otherwise, stick around with me because we're going to take the next few minutes decoding that. So let's start by talking about typographic structure. And those dotted lines may look like something that you might have utilized when you were practicing your handwriting as a child, but those things are specific to typography, and we use them to help us gauge certain aspects, like the baseline. Now, the baseline is present in all typefaces. It is essentially the ledge that the typography rests on in a given line. So the baseline, it's like basically we're the bottom of the typography, but not the extreme bottom, just the bottom that all characters align with. The cap height. So any capitalized letter in a particular typeface will have a cap height, and all the capital letters in that typeface will have the same height. Also notice that in this particular view, we have letters that are going below the baseline, and we're also we have letters that are going above the cap height. I'm going to explain what those are in just a second. What's important to realize, though, is cap height controls the actual display size of the typography. This is Playfair Display and Garriman side by side. Both of these are at the same exact size. Whether they were at 600 pixels or 18 pixels, they would display at these two different proportions from one another. So the cap height determines how large the typography itself appears on screen. X height. This is one of the first phrases that we saw in that original description. And the X height is the height of all lowercase characters in a given typeface. What's important to realize is that the X height is unique per typeface, just like the cap height is unique per typeface. Let's take a quick look at that. Here's Playfair Display and Avenir. Avenir is a fantastic typeface, so is Playfair Display. But notice the difference in X height. Descenders. Descenders are any portion of a character that extends below the baseline. Overhang. Now this is one that gives designers fits sometimes, especially if you are very fussy about your typography, and I'm one of those. In many typefaces, there are overhangs associated particularly with rounded edges. So C's and E's and S's, O's, U's could all potentially have an overhang, not necessarily associated with all typefaces. Some typefaces have no overhang, so it's something to keep an eye out for. Ascenders. Now, ascenders are elements that extend above the X height. So you can see that here we have the B extending above the X height. But notice that ascender is actually taller than our capital B that's located down here at the end. What's going on there? Well, that is considered ascender height. And ascender height is any amount above the cap height for a typeface. We'll talk about style in another video, but this is one of the things where a typeface captures a lot of its personality and style. It's in the ascenders and the descenders of the character form itself. So let's talk about anatomy. Talking about structure just a minute ago. Now let's talk about the anatomy. Let's talk about things that are very specific to particular character. The first one is obviously serifs. This is the one you know. You came in knowing what a serif was. A serif is all the little feet that are denoted in green here. And you'll notice that like they can be on the top, they can be on the bottom, they can be on both sides, they can be on one side. Serifs find their way onto a lot of characters in a serif typeface. On a sans serif typeface, obviously all of those things are gone. The typeface itself is very clean by comparison with a serif typeface. But that doesn't mean that one is necessarily better than the other. It's just a choice, a preference. Counter, that's another term that was mentioned earlier. We wanted large counters for those smaller typefaces. Here, the counter is any enclosed space within a character. So the enclosed area of the R or the G or the O, those are counters. You might be asking, well, Chris, why didn't you mention the E? Well, the E has a special name for its counter, and it is an I. That's pretty much the only I that you will encounter in typography. It's the E itself. Everything else is referred to normally as a counter. Now, aperture is related to counter. These are areas where the character looks like it's going to close, or it gives the indication that it could close, but doesn't. So the upper portion of the A or the C or the E, these are all areas that have an aperture. Stroke contrast is another one I want to mention. This is the difference in the stroke width. As you can see in the first example here, this has an extremely high contrast between the vertical stroke and the horizontal stroke. The horizontal stroke is very thin, and then it extends into the bowl of the R here. As we move over, we have what's referred to as medium contrast, and you can see the difference right away. With high contrast, very thin line on that horizontal stroke that it then extends. With medium contrast, there is a difference between the horizontal and vertical, but it's less pronounced. It calls less attention to itself. A very important designation there, calling less attention to yourself. And then finally, low or no contrast, as you can see here with Helvetica. This is the same exact stroke all the way around, calling absolutely no attention to itself at all. So back to that original phrase, large X height, open counters, medium stroke contrast. So with those things in mind, let's compare 4 different typefaces and see what nets out. So here's X height. You should be able to look at these 2 typefaces and right away tell that Garriman loses here. Garriman has a much smaller X height. As we move over, now we have Proxima Nova as the comparison. Proxima Nova, in terms of counters, this is a condensed weight. We would never really want to choose a condensed weight for a smaller typeface, particularly if it's being used for the body of a paragraph. We want those larger open counters. So here with Literata, we have that, where we don't have it with Proxima Nova condensed. We might have it with the regular Proxima Nova, but not with the condensed. Finally, stroke contrast. And we said we wanted a medium stroke contrast. Anything is going to be better than a very high stroke contrast, which is what we have here. I want to take a look at these examples in use. And here we have them at 18 pixels in size. The first thing I want to focus on is the comparison between our first 2. This is X height on display. The X height of Literata is significantly larger than Garriman. But also on display here is the cap height. Even though these are both 18 pixels in size, notice the difference in size between the 2. Garriman could be adjusted larger, like if we made it 20 pixels in size, that might work out fine. But we still have the X height issue. So Literata beats Garriman for usage here based on X height and cap height. When you look at Proxima Nova in Literata, obviously there are fewer words in the line for Literata than Proxima Nova, but it's easier to read those words. The narrow counters of the condensed style that's being used here is a problem. So based on those wider open counters, Literata wins that comparison. And then there's finally the stroke contrast. And when you look at Literata, there's very little contrast that you can see at the small size. The contrast is helpful. It calls attention to itself. It helps you identify the characters that are on screen, but it doesn't distract you in the way that the stroke contrast on DIDOT does. When you look at that and you look at the NYC, the angles of the N and the Y are very easy to see, but the actual stroke contrast on the C, it almost disappears from the screen because the contrast is so great. And having that stroke contrast is fantastic when it's on a display size, like a headline or like this header of Compare. That'd be great there. But at the smaller size, it creates these little pockets that call a lot of attention to where it's thick, and it's very difficult to see where it's thin. So that's why a medium or no stroke contrast is preferred by comparison. If you found this video useful, please click subscribe. Otherwise, come see us over at newpragmatic.com. I'm Chris Courtney for New Pragmatic. Thanks for watching.